Hello and welcome to another episode of the Cycling Physios, where we aim to develop your knowledge and skills in supporting cyclists of all levels. Whether you are a medical professional, bike fitter or both, we've got a wealth of resources to help advance your practice. Today we are joined by Martin Driscoll, who's the UK Sales Director for Sidas. I've personally been using their insoles in my bike fitting practice since about 2018, and also personally as an athlete, I'm supported by them. So I've got a wealth of practical experience, and that's why I support or recommend these insoles to you guys as well as my athletes. So Bianca, do you want to take over?
Yeah, sure. I just second that as well because I've been using Sidas insoles since I first met Martin in 2018, probably. And now we do them at Sport Silverstone in Vortec as well. So probably what would be useful, Martin, because obviously I've had a chat with you and know kind of a little bit about some of your thoughts, but it might be worth just telling everyone kind of a little bit more about you and about Sidas as well.
Yeah, so quickly about me then. I've been doing this sort of stuff for 22 years. So I've been fitting insoles, making bespoke insoles, fitting footwear of all kinds for 22 years. I've been working for Sidas now for 15 of those. So I've seen absolutely both sides of the fence, from the medical aspect with our brand Podiatech. So I used to support 170 podiatrists and physios with that side of the business. And I'm now currently looking after around about 100 retail accounts on the sporting goods side of the business, with a few of our other brands as well. So yeah, really kind of get to see it all. We're working with professional sports teams across the board. So we're working in Premiership football, we're working in cycling, obviously, and all sorts of different sort of everything you could imagine. We're kind of there now. So everything from F1 pit crews and all this sort of stuff. So we really do see a lot of injury prevention type of stuff as well. Sidas as a company been going since 1975, so we'll be celebrating 50 years next year, and that all started just with one guy saying, hey, we need to find a solution for athletes who are uncomfortable in their sports footwear. It really started with winter sports athletes. It quite quickly developed into running, into golf, into bike, excuse me. And after 10 years, we then ventured off into the medical side of things with our brand Podiatech. So we're steeped in history now, I think, and we're fairly well established as a bike fitter's choice for insoles.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Was it? I think you told me it was skiing that was like one of the first sports. Is that right?
Skiing very much the first sport, and very quickly was adapted by the athletes. And the story actually was just the founder of Sidas was walking on a beach in Hawaii, saw his footprint in the sand and realized actually I can use that sort of sand type thing to make a replication of someone's foot, and then took a gratin dish from the cupboard, put a sheet of thermoformable plastic inside, chucked it in the oven, and using a pillow off of his bed molded the first custom insole. So that's kind of how it all kicked off 50 years ago.
Well, it's probably worth you elaborating a little bit more then about what is an insole, because for some people watching, they might not even really know what an insole actually is.
Yeah, so an insole can actually be anything from a stock liner that goes underneath the plantar surface of your foot that's inside the shoe already. This can be a two-dimensional insole, or what we call a two-dimensional insole. So it offers comfort from just one direction, so down from the surface of the foot underneath. Then you move on to things like 3D insoles, so some insoles that have got a little bit of shape, and that could be anything from just mild arch support to an arch and a heel as well. And then you start moving into custom or bespoke insoles, which are obviously molded to the shape of your foot. And then if we talk about orthotics, because orthotics is a word that's used quite specifically within our industry, orthotics, strangely, isn't a protected title. Anyone can make orthotics. It's a big grey area in our market. So whether we're making insoles, we're making footbeds, or we're making orthotics, they're all the same thing. They're all designed to support your foot. We'll get onto a bit later the varying ways in which they can support your foot, in which we can and can't do potentially.
Do you think when you buy an off-the-shelf product now, let's say you buy, paracycling shoes, are the insoles that come with those shoes sufficient for individuals, really?
No, and I think the brands often know this as well, and there's a very specific reason that they don't invest tons and tons of money into insoles, and it's because they want to offer the consumer choice. or the fitter choice. They want to have that choice. They know if they go and put an even more expensive, even more technical insole inside that shoe, not only is it going to push the price of their shoe up and potentially push that shoe out of the market, but you lose the choice and you could end up paying an extra 30, 40, 50 pounds for an insole that's going to end up in the bin because it's not the right thing. They would much rather prefer you to start with something very simple, very basic, very cheap, and upgrade it. And for me, it's a much more logical way of doing things than wasting product and chucking it away.
And do you think there's much difference between some of the kind of more kind of developed insoles that you can buy off the shelf versus a custom insole now? Has technology kind of improved some of these general off the shelf options for individuals?
100%. So if you look at the way that we're designing insoles now, we're using pressure plates, we're using 3D foot scanning, we're using that average of those scans and those lasts that we've taken across Europe, amalgamating that data into the perfect fit for each size, not only for a normal, say a size 26 is the industry standard in Mondo point for footwear. What will happen with a lot of brands is they'll just scale it up and scale it down for arch height or arch width or all of this sort of stuff. But what we're doing is taking the data specific to each foot size, making sure that is the generic fit for that foot. So yes, technology is making off-the-shelf solutions much, much better. Feet are very, very complex, and there's a lot going on with them in terms of the size of the arch. And it's not just that, it's the width of the foot, it's the height of the transverse arch through the metatarsal zone, all of these factors that unless you're going to stock 200 different kinds of off-the-shelf insole, you're never going to get an absolutely 100% perfect fit.
Yeah.
So then that kind of takes us to the point of, how appropriate is a simple off-the-shelf orthotic versus a completely custom-made orthotic or insole? And where's that transition point from somebody who will be perfectly comfortable and functional with an off-the-shelf orthotic versus who maybe now needs to shift to, let's face it, the more expensive option in terms of the completely customized orthotic?
The two real extremes are the real issues. It's the really, really low arch flat, heavily pronated feet and really, really high arch, potentially supinating feet that will struggle with something off the shelf. They're the two extremes. Whilst we know that sort of 50% of people would be absolutely fine with an off-the-shelf solution, assuming that it's correctly fitted. In particular, I'll talk about our 3 feet range later, which is 3 different arch heights. If that is fitted correctly, 50% of the time it's going to be absolutely brilliant and it's going to fit the foot really well. What you get when you move on to customization of insoles is changing the stiffness, changing angles of things. You really move into the fine tuning and the better fit of really just getting that fit 100%.
I think that's the important thing there, is appreciating that bell curve, in that most people don't need to spend a vast amount of money on a customized insole or orthotic. And most people are going to be perfectly well supported by that off-the-shelf orthotic, provided it is the right design for their specific foot shape and their foot type.
Yeah, and I think you've hit the nail on the head there with the pricing, is that pricing is a big factor here. Custom insoles are expensive, off the shelf are much more affordable. And if it's the difference between nothing in a shoe, poor biomechanics, bad offloading of the foot, and something that they can't afford, then why not? Something off the shelf is definitely going to be beneficial.
Exactly. And the off-the-shelf orthotics insoles, they're not that expensive, really. When you think about the price of the shoe itself, it's a small fraction of. And that's it. I think you raised an interesting point earlier on there, in that most of the shoes you're buying, the insole is nothing. It's the manufacturer is almost expecting you to take it out and replace it with something. So absolutely, if the shoe's not quite working for you, it's probably that the footbed just isn't quite customized to your needs, and that customization can be quite simply just picking a version off the shelf to swap it in for. Yeah. So I suppose that kind of answered our question of, do all cyclists need to add an insole into their shoes? It's going to be no, not all. but most people will get some benefit from adding an off-the-shelf insole, and there'll be a small proportion who would also benefit from a more customized insole or orthotic. And I suppose we, as practitioners, then need to appreciate our biases in terms of who are we seeing. So Bianca and myself as physios, we will tend to see those more complicated bike fits.
Yeah.
So we will then therefore see more people who need something adding in. Whereas if you're a bike fitter who is not a medical background, maybe working in a bike shop, maybe a higher proportion of your clientele are not going to be that more complicated medical case, and therefore certainly will be able to take just a simple off-the-shelf insole, and that will solve most of the problems.
And it's
And
interesting, Martin. Yeah.
Um,
Right. I was going to say, Martin, because you were saying, is having something that's kind of super optimized for that individual, required, when sometimes actually just putting something in is better than nothing. But often people have got pre-existing insoles for like walking or running, and they always ask, oh, does that mean, would I have the same insole for cycling versus running? So I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, good one. So let's start with podiatrist made orthotics, because that's often one of the bigger challenges that we see. Because my podiatrist made these insoles, these are the ones I want to use. And we run into a few challenges. For a start, orthotics that are made for shoes, normal day-to-day walking shoes, are often 3/4 or half length. When you put 3/4 and half length shoes, specifically in bike shoes, you run into issues with feeling cleat screws, you run into issues of feeling stitching or gluing around the toe, and it's not comfortable. And vents as well, vents from underside of the shoe, you'd often end up feeling that through the forefoot, and it'd be extremely uncomfortable. But the other thing is your insoles that you've had made for your shoes for walking are designed for a 4.5 motion, a heel strike to a toe off, not the acceleration phase, which is toe off. So if we can put your foot in a position with an insole that is not including a heel strike and a mid stance, and it's purely an acceleration device, I think you get a better result. If you're then looking at off the shelf versus custom, because of that better fit, you do get better performance. We'll move on to some of the problems maybe later that you can address with a custom device, but quite often the common problems in cycling are going to be forefoot pressure, pins and needles, pain, burning sensations, which is often that there's not enough support through the transverse arch here, through the metatarsal dome. Now, this is the bit that on a off-the-shelf insole is going to be very, very difficult to get right, and where custom will take an exact replication of that part of the foot. And obviously the transverse arch, everyone sort of thinks it kind of stops here, but it actually comes all the way back here into the midfoot as well. So that's something you have to consider, that you're offloading all of these metatarsals and not through the arch specifically.
Before we move on to asking you some questions about probably designing a custom insole or designing a Sidas insole, it might be useful actually for people who are watching, who are healthcare practitioners, etc., that might not have an understanding about like why you might design an insole that way, and what Sidas's philosophy is on that, and how that relates to kind of the biomechanics of cycling, really.
So I've just got a couple of examples here actually, just to sort of show that the first thing that we always take into consideration is what is the shoe that we're actually going to be fitting. So here I've got a custom skiing insole, and then I'm going to put a custom bike insole of the same size over the top. I think it's quite clear that there's a bit of a shape difference there. So that's the first thing, is we're considering how much space do we actually have in a bike shoe, and they're very, very low volume. They're much the same challenges as football boots. They're very, very low volume. And then the next thing is how much space do we have this way? You can see that this bike insole is much, much thinner than a ski insole. Again, it's a volume thing. We don't have tons and tons and tons of space to play with in there. Once we've established kind of the cutting pattern, if you like, which is the shape of the overall insole, then we start considering how much control do we actually need to put into this? How much movement is the foot going to be making? So if I explain to you quickly about how insoles are constructed from us, we use these resins. So here you've got a white resin, which is a full length resin. It runs all the way down, all the way to the heel of the insole. That's quite stiff. So that's not going to flex at all. A ski boot isn't designed to flex. So we can get away with putting something much, much firmer in there. And the movement is obviously not a 4.5, it's a lateral movement. So we can make it quite stiff. These two extra resins that are added on later are the things that give it its support once it's been molded. So the white layer here will sort of shape to the foot, if you like, and it's these layers here that once they're bonded together, that's what gives you the control of how the foot is moving. So we change these specific shapes as well to how we want that foot to move in that footwear. So there's a skiing one. If I give you a trail running one for an example, now we've got something a bit different with the shape of the reinforcement here. So we know that generally we want some flexibility through the heel unit here. We don't want crazy amounts of support. So we've still got a little bit of flexibility. We're not blocking the midfoot. We're not trying to make anything too rigid here. And then again, choice of materials here. We're using Pro Grip, which is the stuff you make basketballs out of. It's very, very grippy. And for a trail runner, that's a huge advantage because it means they're not going to slide around in the shoe. So things like top sheets, breathable, really grippy, moisture management wise, they're really, really good. So we're trying to tune each time what goes into that. But stiffness is the main thing, which we can talk about as well.
Because what do you think for molding these Sidas insoles for individuals? So not everyone might have seen the process of how you would go about that with the Sidas and machines and stuff, but what kind of foot positions do you think we should be molding in, especially when we take into account that if you do something in standing versus a squat position, it might change like the loading patterns through the foot and the shape of the foot?
Yeah, I think the number one thing that I always tell people is don't forget that pronation is a cheat mechanism for dorsiflexion. That's the biggest, because we are going to ideally put someone in a more neutral position, which will take out some of the dorsiflexion. So that's the biggest thing I could say to people, that when we mold, we have to be conscious of that. Specifically for bike, we need to be conscious of the heel to toe drop. We don't want the heel being lower than the toes, obviously, because the bike shoe doesn't put your foot into that position. So we'll generally mold with the heel slightly higher than the toe. And then you touched on sort of like a more neutral position. So ideally, yes, we want someone in a subtalar neutral position, but that might change depending on if they can achieve a neutral position, because some people just can't. They can't get their foot there. What does it do to everything else when you start looking above the ankles? What does it do to the global picture? Does it change anything too dramatically? And then what does it do to forefoot position? Because sometimes putting someone's rear foot into a drastically neutral position will actually give them quite a large forefoot varus that's genuinely there, and you're not going to have enough space in the shoe to get anywhere near able to wedge it. So sometimes you have to go outside of that rule, if you like. But for the most part, we're molding people stood up in a neutral position, and we're making sure that the forefoot is as level as we can possibly get it, or at least as level as their foot can actually tolerate.
And you're definitely right about that whole, if you block dorsiflexion, does that cause some additional problems? Because you might get smaller riders who are on longer cranks. They're very stiff through the feet. So generally not just through the ankle, but through the midfoot. And if you block all of that, you put an insole in, actually it just creates further problems with the kinetic chain. So yeah, that's the difficulty, I think, of like just putting an insole in an isolated session sometimes and not kind of taking into account like the bigger picture. I
100%.
don't know what you think, Martin, as well. To some people, I've seen some people when they're like not just necessarily for CDAS, but other protocols for kind of molding. Sometimes they'll place people in quite a heavily plantar flex position as well. Like you said, sometimes raising the heel. But then if you do that and you achieve a foot position and mold the insole, what might that do to their dorsiflexion? And do you think that's sometimes like the best? I don't know, it's a tricky one probably to answer, but do you think that's then sometimes the best thing to do if they have got a dorsiflexion restriction, because then, might impact on everything else?
I mean, with all of this, experience obviously comes into play, because you're having to look at how that person's moving, and the more people you've seen and the more bike fits you've done and the more shoes you've looked at, because shoes are a big part as well. But yeah, I wouldn't mold anyone in too crazy a plantar flex position. It's not relative to the shoe, so there's absolutely no benefits whatsoever. So you basically try and replicate the heel to toe drop of the shoe, which is generally 1 to 2 centimeters heel to toe drop, something like that. Is sufficient. You don't need to go crazy and put people in a massively plantar flex position. And then we could talk about the windlass mechanism as well. I still see a lot of people using the windlass mechanism. For me, the windlass mechanism of curling your toes up is a great way to get your foot into a resupinated, more stable, more neutral position. However, if you were to mold with the toes up in a windlass position, all it does is actually collapse this metatarsal dome area and this transverse arch. It's a little bit like doing this with your hand, but the more you extend your fingers, the flatter that area becomes. So actually using a windlass mechanism to find a more neutral position is handy, but then you can drop the toes back down and allow that metatarsal dome here just to reappear and to take it into the mold, if you like.
Something that
the way that we're assessing our feet, and it's making sure that you appreciate that the mechanics of how the foot is working in a cycling shoe is different to the mechanics of how the foot operates walking, running. Whereas most medical practitioners here will have learned how to assess a foot and think about the biomechanics in terms of walking. And then some will be thinking about it in the biomechanics of how the foot works as a runner. And it's really appreciating that everything you've learned so far around how the biomechanics of the foot works is not going to be applicable in the same way when it comes to how the foot is operating in a cycling shoe, particularly the type of cycling shoe. And then also what you guys were just saying about the amount of dorsiflexion or plantar flexion that's happening throughout the pedal stroke. And individuals will have greater or lesser ranges of ankle mobility through a pedal stroke, as Bianca pointed out, regarding different crank lengths. And that needs to be thought about in terms of, well, how much plantar flexion and dorsiflexion is needed. Some people will ride with a very, very stiff ankle, and therefore you don't need to maybe worry about too much dorsiflexion being allowed. But other people will need a lot of dorsiflexion going over the top of the pedal stroke. So it's understanding the individual kind of mechanics and habits and movement patterns of that rider, and then adapting your decision making to that rider rather than it being a prescriptive, oh, we need to fit in this degree of dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, whatever it might be.
Yeah,
definitely. And if we're talking about forces, being very different versus other sports, the other thing then to think about surely is like the shoe, because at what point do you say this shoe is not optimal for us to put an insole in? Because if it's super soft and it increases like the lateral motion, is that a good point for an insole?
Yeah, well, soft shoes, whilst an insole will kind of help with a really soft shoe that's not suitable, the end answer is no, it's not really going to give them a big gain. So, you can use an insole to offload, and people that are getting pains and problems with their feet because a shoe is too soft, sometimes an insole will help offload and alleviate some of that pressure, but ultimately, no, it won't. The interesting thing is a lot of people still don't understand how your foot changes through pronation and elongation and what happens within a shoe fit. And that what happens when you put an insole in. An insole isn't taking up space in the shoe. That's the first thing to point out. An insole is filling up empty space or voids that already exist inside the shoe. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is when you weight bear on a foot, it gets longer, it gets lower, it gets wider. Now, in footwear, 6 millimeters is about the difference between a narrow lasted shoe and a wide one. And this is a size 9 skeleton. I can make this spread out nearly 1 centimeter. So I can make this go from a narrow skeleton to a wide one just by pushing down on the top of the foot. Feet do that. The minute you put an insole back underneath here and all these arches of the foot regain again, the foot gets shorter, the arch gets higher, and all these underneath, all these arches that we're talking about underneath are all going to get higher again and make the foot smaller. So that's the biggest thing to consider. We're seeing shoes for cycle specifically being sold way too big because lasts are generally quite small, they're quite narrow, and people are wanting a specific kind of shoe, so they then upsize. And I mean, you guys will have seen this. You see people upsizing because they want a specific shoe and not the one that fits their foot, and then it ends up creating all sorts of headaches with cleat position. The last thing to touch on there with shoe fit is the place where you get foothold in a shoe, in any shoe, is across the instep and the ankle here. And the minute that that foot pronates and that instep drops down, you've now lost foothold. The first solution to regaining foothold is to tighten your boas, laces, or Velcro, and you've now sent your foot to sleep. So maintaining this arch and keeping it up here and really securing over the top here and getting this volume right means that you're going to end up with a foot that doesn't go to sleep unnecessarily because you're over tightening shoes.
It's a really good point, that is, Martin, because there's a lot of people definitely that have come in and they've had problems around that, and it's literally just because they needed some sort of orthotic support in there. But it's interesting that you say about, you know, keeping the foot kind of in that position, because perhaps it's a topic that's beyond this discussion today, but it's one to maybe think about with the Chris Stair, is that there's quite a few different beliefs that exist within the production of cycling orthotics. And on one hand, you've got the kind of let the foot be dynamic, let the foot do what it wants, which, but then to be fair, is that relative as well for the amount of dorsiflexion someone wants and their individual requirements versus a really super stiff, solid insole. But the reality is that will your foot actually stay in that one position? Because some people are going to have a more mobile foot, surely, and you will get deformation of the foot over the top of the insole. So how much can you control that? You know what I mean, when it comes to insole production, and how much can you really control that?
Yeah, so I've grabbed you a couple of examples here. So if we take, here's our two bike models, Bike Pro Slim and Bike Pro Ultra. They're out of the box, or molded, I should say. They're both relatively stiff in terms of our range. The only thing being stiffer, I would say, is our custom ski insole, which, as I said to you already, is a full length kind of polyplast. It's very stiff, and it doesn't really move. The stiffness of, that's the beauty of custom insoles, is that they are bespoke and will flex how we want them to flex. Now, Sidas have obviously done a lot of research over 50 years of how stiff these devices need to be. And we guess, we take an educated guess of how stiff we should make these things out the packet for you guys as fitters. And then we give you solutions to make them stiffer or softer. So if we take this one here, so that's our Bike Pro Slim, that's our best-selling bike insole, you can delaminate this. You can actually take off these resin components to make the device softer. Now, that's not often the case. You wouldn't normally want to make something softer. You generally make it a little bit stiffer. So we sell these shapes in self-adhesive kind of pre-backed, so you can stick them on and make them stiffer that way. And then you mentioned Chris Stair there, Bianca. So Chris Stair is a product for us. It's a closed cell EVA product. It's very lightweight. It's got some really cool characteristics. It's super lightweight. When it's hot, it's extremely moldable. And being closed cell, it means its shock absorbing qualities are excellent. So that's really good for runners, for us, and for cyclists. And then what it means is we can build up the level of control, let a rider test it, and then if we need to make it softer, we can grind more out. So here's an example of one that's been ground out. I've done it on a custom ski insole just for you guys to have a little bit of contrast, so you can see that's been glued on, it's been ground off. And then here is the really interesting point. You can build in the level of control and how much angle you build into the base here. So this has been ground off very flat. If you wanted to grind angles in, you can do that as well. And actually, if you wanted to leave any sort of forefoot wedging in, you would bring this Chris Stair much further forward and grind the forefoot wedge into it as well. So Chris Stair is a really interesting product for us. You mentioned the different flexibilities of people's feet. Now, there's, in my eyes, some general characteristics around foot types. You've generally got low arch, overpronated, weak and wobbly, a bit floppy, and could probably do with a bit of help. You've then got about 10% of the population that are kind of perfect. Their foot doesn't roll in, it doesn't roll out. You've got a fairly decent arch, but what it does mean is they've got a fair bit of space underneath here, and they're not really loading across all the metatarsals. They're just across 1 and 5 and the heel. There's nothing really underneath. And then you've got the high arch, really supinating, really rigid feet that can't be moved in any which way or whatever, and are super firm. Great actually for cycling, but rubbish for everything else because they've got no natural shock absorption. So runners with heavy runners with very high arch feet really struggle with the shock that the foot's going through because it's not acting like a spring, like it's supposed to when it's less locked up, let's say. So how would I choose the stiffness of an insole, and how would I choose what I'm trying to do? Well, firstly, it's a comfort thing. Let's remember that there's always the comfort and the performance aspects with these things. First of all, the comfort side of things, is it going to offload something that's already existing? So if someone's got forefoot pain, or they've got a really specific pressure point on one of their metatarsals, for example, or they've got a lot of heel pain, of course, if you take the force of their body and you spread it out across the whole sole of their foot, you're going to make them more comfortable. Then we move on to sort of the stiffness and the performance side of things, is how stiff do we think someone could tolerate? Generally, my test is a supination resistance test. I take 2 fingers underneath the arch of the foot here, and I'm trying to resupinate the foot. I'm trying to see how much force does it take to get that foot to resupinate. If I can barely move it, and the foot is so pronated, and I actually want it back in a straight position, I know that I'm going to have to make sure, A, that person is molded, and this is probably going to answer your question to where off the shelf kind of finishes, is this person has to be molded in really, really neutral position. And the easiest analogy I have here is if you imagine anything standing up straight on a table, like a can of Coke or anything like this, if it's in its straight position, 90 degrees to the floor, it doesn't require any support from the outside to keep it straight. The minute that a pronated the pronated foot starts to drift into pronation, it requires some support to push it back up straight. And the more it rolls over, the more support it needs. So when you get people who are specifically saying, hey, this insole feels like it's pushing into my foot, most people's solution is to go and take some support away to make it softer and not be as prominent. And actually the solution is normally to increase the support and put the foot back up into a more neutral position again. On the flip side of that, you've then got the really, really fixed high arch feet that even if they're 150 kilos, you put 2 fingers underneath the arch, it's going to supinate really, really easily because it's already inclined to do so. It needs very, very little support in terms of the flexibility of the insole. But what it does need is to fill up all these big spaces underneath and offloading those hot spots that you would generally get with that specific type of foot. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. Yeah. I think the only thing I'd say is, what about those kind of middle ground feet, or maybe the ones that are quite dynamic, and they might have a really good kind of active medial or transverse arch, but then what happens is that as they push and their forefoot pressures increase, actually they deform and they lengthen instead of shortening.
Yeah.
For lots of different reasons. Maybe it's foot control, maybe it's like a lot of intrinsic strength and things as well. But I guess we're making an assumption that someone's got to have one insole, and this is probably something that Tim will talk about in a bit, one insole, and then that sticks with them. What about sometimes with those individuals, they might feedback, oh, it just feels a bit too firm, or, it's creating some pressure spots. Is there not a role to use the orthotic as a bit of a tool as well, and start them off on something softer, get their foot better, strengthen the foot, and then move to something potentially more dynamic as well with time?
Yeah, the good thing is, because we're taking an exact replica of somebody's foot, they often won't complain of that feeling too aggressive in a certain spot. When you start looking at lab built or lab made insoles that have been made externally from a third party who's reading a prescription, the practitioner says, oh, I want a met dome in there. How big met dome do you want? 1 mil, 2 mil, 3 mil, 4 mil, 5 mil? It's a bit of a guessing game. So, when you start getting people with bespoke orthotics or bespoke insoles from that side of things, it's quite difficult. But if we're taking a direct replica of somebody's foot in a neutral position, we're not pushing any material underneath the foot or trying to put anything in there that doesn't already exist, generally speaking, people are pretty comfortable. I guess at the end of the day, it depends on what you're trying to achieve. If you're trying to hold someone in a really, really nice, straight, neutral position, then that's the position they need to be in. If it's affecting everything higher up than the ankles, then you need to sometimes look outside the box and do something a bit different.
Yeah, nice summary.
So you mentioned a couple of things like sort of hotspots. So we think about maybe some of the most common complaints that a client will present with. That might be that sort of hotspot pain under the forefoot.
Yeah.
And with thinking about, you mentioned there about the sort of metatarsal dome to help try and sort of spread that. Do you want to maybe talk a little bit more about what the sort of off-the-shelf options are in terms of that support for the metatarsal dome versus whether that then needs to be a more customized version?
Yeah, to be honest, it's more of a compliance thing when you get onto metatarsal domes, because as I said earlier, getting the dimensions of this area here right are quite difficult. Getting the position of a metatarsal dome is quite difficult. It might be something that you do stick it on later. So you would buy your off-the-shelf insole and then you use little stick-on metatarsal domes, which we do, a little self-adhesive metatarsal dome. And then it's about placement. One of my tricks, if I can give away a little bit of a tip here, is actually to use lipstick on the sole of the foot. So if you look at where your met dome needs to go in and you blob a little bit of lipstick on here and then put the foot back onto the insole, X marks the spot, that's where your metatarsal dome is going to go back into. Unfortunately, metatarsal domes are a little bit like geese. They tend to migrate. So if you've stuck them on, they won't stay there, or they might stay there for a while. But really, if something's been molded into a device, where you can see this one here's got a metatarsal, I don't know if you guys can see that on the camera, but this one here's got a metatarsal dome. It's molded into the resin of the plastic here, and it's not going anywhere regardless of how much your foot goes in over the top of it.
Something I tend to do is use a bit of stick-on felt and just try that shape, test that position. No, needs to come back another millimeter, retest that. And then once we've identified where it needs to be, then we can look at a more long-term solution.
Yeah, you can do things like, so this cover here, this is actually available in a self-adhesive roll. Once you're happy with things like metatarsal dome positions or cutouts or things that you've made to offload, you can then roll this self-adhesive material over the top, which gives it a whole nother durability aspect as well, because it's just really, really durable and really good for moisture. But it just holds all those components together and stops them from shifting and moving.
So you mentioned durability there.
Yeah.
So how often or how long are these insoles going to last? You know, when we think about walking and running, we often think about, right, they've only got a limited lifespan because of the amount of movement, the flex, stress going through that insole. Whereas a cycling insole is going to be slightly different in that regard. So what's your anticipated lifespan of a cycling insole?
It's very much a how long is a piece of string question, that, because it depends who's using it. It depends on the level of support that insole's having to provide to the foot. So for me, for example, very high arch, very rigid foot, quite heavy. They don't squash down at all, and I can use them for years and years and years and years, miles and miles and miles. If you've got someone, which 80% of our population pronate to some degree, then obviously they're going to start, the insole is going to start pushing onto the foot, and then the foot is going to start squashing it down over time. Now, there's some other things that can affect this. Things like, have you left your shoes on the parcel shelf of your car in outdoors in the middle of summer? Because of course the temperatures will start to affect not only the insole, but the resins and things that are inside the shoe as well. But also the shoe itself, if it's a brand new shoe versus an older shoe, we're relying on the structure of the sides of the shoe as well to hold the foot. The insole is never going to do all of it. We're relying on that shoe to help support the foot and hold it in the right place. The minute that shoe starts to deform, now the insole is the thing that's doing all the holding. So it is very much a how long is a piece of string question. If they're looked after as well, they can be sponge washed. Nearly all insoles can be sponge washed, hot soapy or warm soapy water, I should say. But yeah, as long as they're looked after, generally speaking, I'd say the life of a shoe. We normally say in running and walking, it's the life of the shoe. In cycling, it's a bit different because of the forces and stuff involved. The shoe being stiff as it is. But yeah, generally speaking, life of the shoe.
But it might be the material that prompts someone to get a new set made rather than the stiffness of the insole per se, I guess.
Yeah, the funniest thing when you see athletes back for a second fitting of a custom insole and you make them a new one, and then you put the old one versus the new one, and they're much different, that's the point where you go, okay, yeah, you should have maybe come in and got these sorted a bit sooner. The simple test for me is put the insole on the floor without a shoe and sitting down, just place the foot on top of the insole. Does the insole make contact with the whole of the foot? If it doesn't, then chances are it's been squashed down a bit and it maybe needs changing.
Yeah, so that's something to kind of build into the off the bike assessment. Is we obviously look at the shoe, we look at the shape, look at the wear patterns, any rub marks, obviously cleat position. But yeah, take those insoles out and have a good look at those insoles, and see, are they still actually doing the job that they were designed to do in the first place.
Yeah.
What about, you've obviously shown us a couple of different options in terms of cycling insoles. Is it potentially a case that somebody might want different insoles for different cycling shoes, obviously depending on the discipline of their cycling? Do we need to be looking at a different insole for somebody who's doing crit racing versus long enduro, gravel riding, these type of things?
Go back to the kind of the demands of the shoe, I would say. So generally speaking, if it's a road type shoe or based off of a road type shoe, so triathlon, TT, or normal road cycling, then generally speaking, it's going to be one of these two models. Once you get into things like cyclocross, that's a whole different thing again, because you're now jumping off the bike and running in shoes that are maybe not designed to be run for super long distances in. Depending on the firmness of the ground, you're expecting different sorts of sensations underneath your feet. So we might look at something like one of our comfort insoles that has a 4-foot pad in it as well, just to sort of remove some of those vibrations and some of those shocks from mounting and dismounting the bike. Yeah, triathlon's another funny one, because most people actually now get on really well with these two models in triathlon. And I'll just quickly talk about the differences between these two. So they both cut off of exactly the same pattern, exactly the same shape. When we produced this insole here, which is our Bike Pro Slim, we fitted the Astana team and they said, yeah, really like how the cut feels. We really like the sensation, but we wish it was a little bit stiffer and a bit lighter. So it's interesting that they were actually weighing these and working out that they wanted something slightly lighter. So this came along in 2020. We all know what happened in 2020. Airbus, the aeroplane manufacturer, having a bit of a tough time of it, I think. And this is the first time that we've introduced, I don't know if you guys can see, this is a fiberglass based reinforcement. So normally all of our reinforcements are a glue resin, but this particular one is actually a fiberglass resin. So this is now half the thickness of our existing resin, and we're now 8 times stiffer, and a size large in this model weighs the same as a medium in this model. So we've got some real performance advantages going with that new Bike Pro Ultra.
Very cool. Okay, Bianca, was there anything else you wanted to ask?
Yeah, actually, probably. When it comes to Sidas insoles, I mean, I would say for me, they're super easy, super accessible for people like practitioners to use. But why do you think other practitioners should use them? Because that, now there's so many options on the market. Is it that how do you as a healthcare practitioner choose this brand or a certain brand to go, yeah, that's what I'm going to work with?
If I give you other people's opinions, maybe rather than my own, but why other people choose our brand is they have control over what they're making themselves and can do it in a timely manner in their own clinic or practice, and have the patient leaves with a solution on the same day. Loads of bespoke orthotics. I keep talking about bespoke orthotics in particular here, but bespoke orthotics generally would take a couple of weeks to come back, whether that be from a plaster of Paris mold, from a foam box, or from a 3D scan using a structure sensor. So generally speaking, our custom side of things, people like the control and the flexibility, as well as the sort of customer service side from Sidas, that we have a UK warehouse. We can generally ship stuff out within 48 hours. It means that people don't have to hold loads and loads and loads of stock. And this goes for the same for off the shelf as well, which we actually haven't spoken about. I've just got a couple of examples here of our off the shelf insoles. So this is our 3 feet slim product. It comes in 3 different arch heights. We can supply tools for measuring arch heights and measuring the size of feet with our 3 feet revelator device. And the beauty here is that this is actually a great solution, not just for bike shoes and football boots or back to school, but it's also pre-chamfered here. So it's great for things like deck shoes and loafers or lower volume footwear. So if you get cyclists who are keen on insoles but want some for additional shoes, then this is great just for dress shoes like brogues and things like that as well.
Yeah,
I also think the other thing, Martin, is is the price. Actually, it's super
Yeah.
super affordable, especially compared to some of the off the shelf options that you have. It's almost worth just saying, well, I'm just going to get a pair of bespoke, like
And I was
custom
going to
from you.
touch on that earlier before we jumped onto something else, is that the cost of machinery and the space available in practices isn't always there. A custom solution isn't always the most suitable thing at the time, for space and money reasons. But yeah, off the shelf gives a really, really accessible price point for people, not only the end consumer, but the practitioner as well. They don't need loads and loads of commitment up front and loads of stock holding. And quite often we'll have people start off with this for a few years, they'll be really happy with it, and then they'll get to a position where they're happy to go for a custom machine and start making bespoke insoles when they're more confident and happy with feet and what they're doing there. So yeah, it's an option.
Is there a way as well for future clients to find out who is a Sidas operator or producer? Because that's something that always comes up in conversation. Oh, you're a little bit too far away. Is there someone near me?
Yeah, it's something that comes up in our conversations fairly regularly as well. And unfortunately, the difficulty is if we have a dealer locator, is someone might turn up at your clinic expecting a pair of ski insoles, and you're actually a bike specialist and you're stocking bike insoles. But people can always touch base with our office team or myself and ask where the nearest place where they can have some Sidas insoles from is. But yeah, it's something that crops up quite regularly in discussion within our team as well, to get a dealer locator in place, which you never know, it might happen in future, but for now we don't have a current dealer locator for the UK.
But if we have got practitioners listening who are looking to develop their practice, are offering insoles and stocking Sidas products, how can they go about? Is it getting in touch with yourself to set up an account, B2B account? What's the process?
Yeah, so get in touch with myself, Bianca. I think you might have a slide in a moment just with some contact.
I'll put it on afterwards. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Perfect. And yeah, otherwise people can go on https://www.sidasworld.co.uk/B2B, and they can register for our B2B page, which is essentially online shopping for the trade, and they can see all of our products and pricing on there. No problem.
Fantastic. Well, as I say, I've been using your products for many years now. I think since 2018, I first started stocking them. Bianca, same for yourself. So we can certainly speak for the usefulness and value of having these as part of your practice. So thank you very much for your time today, Martin. Like I said, we'll share all your contact details, how people can get in touch, as well as the links to Sidas World itself. So if people do want to get in touch with you, set up an account, and start offering this through their practices, then that's how they can do it.
Great.
Obviously, we've got a wealth of other books, other webinars that we've had, presentations that we've done on how to improve your knowledge and skills in terms of managing the injured cyclist and bike fitting in general, including foot pathologies and common foot complaints that cyclists may present with. So do have a look at our YouTube channel on the website, and we will be having more online educational content coming up